Okay, the Constitution, one of the most used and abused documents, I think, in history. For some, it's a ball and chain that holds the organisation back. Other organisations, it's used like a weapon to try and achieve a political or a power outcome. And often, too, they are cumbersome. They're I think, a part of the historical background of the organisation, where everything was clumped into the one document and you had myriads of bylaws and other things, and it just simply became a cumbersome document. What I would suggest is that if you've got a document like that, or you're working with an organisation that does, is don't try and panel beat it. It's much easier to replace it than try and put a Band-Aid on it. And as an example, this hot link, which I've put down the bottom here, is to a constitution that the Australian Sports Commission have put up free on their website called Sport Australia. Particularly good document. Michael Johnston from the Commission put it together, and I'd argue that it would be one of the better documents you'll find if you want to look at a good template. Most state departments of sport and rec and others all have similar sorts of documents. Okay, what I also talk about when people look at their constitutions is splitting them apart and coming up with different layers. And the three things that I argue is pull out all of the stuff that relates to how the board operates, not how they're elected, but how they operate, and put it into a board charter. Then pull out the organisational and administrative stuff out of the Constitution and the bylaws and put it into a management document. And then the third is to have a policy bank. And within the policy bank, I then recommend three different layers again. First layer is your governance policies, how the organisation is governed, and those all relate to the way that the board operates. The next are your management policies, how the organisation's managed from a day-to-day basis. If you've got staff, it could be things from use of telephones down to cars to whatever it is, but it's how we do our business. And the third layer is, in the sporting context, is your sport policies, how the sport's administered and played, including how people are to behave. Now, the third area is the one that is public. It's the sort of policies that you do need to have on your website and other areas so people can readily access them and they know they've got the latest version. Now, membership structures is a curly one because people are so wedded to the way it has always been. But if you look at the key principle, and we talked about being a principle-driven organisation earlier, members are the owners. And if you work on that basis, you think about what flows from it, equity of ownership. So therefore, one member, one vote, which would then remove the proportional voting that many organisations unfortunately still hold. So starting to bring equity into that relationship. But would also, if you look at the principle of members being the owners, we then bring into the argument that directors should be non-voting. They're governors, not owners, and this would also include the CEO. So there's some quite obvious consequences of adopting a principle-based approach, and then the logical next step that flows from it. Okay, bust a major myth. The peak body is the controlling body, and it has the power. And I work a lot in the not-for-profit, and I've been the board mentor for the Australian Newsagents Federation. I've worked with Australian National Uni and a range of others. Generally, and it's a big statement, generally I only hear the word power and control pretty much in the sporting context. It is something that they're predisposed to, about being in charge, being in control. And I try and coach people to adopt a slightly different approach and to say, if the owners have the power, because they are the owners, what they give is authority to the board, not power. What we're heading for is a partnership approach that leads or on the basis of servant leadership. As opposed to power and control, we talk about authority, responsibility, and obligation. Different principles. And I think those principles tend to generate a different level of activity and response. Okay, where I'm coming from, just to elaborate a little bit further, it's not about owning the house, it's about caring for it, about cradling it, and the house obviously being the organisation. And that's the sort of message that we try and get through to support these good governance principles. Okay, reviewing the board structure. Now, this is one where I think we probably get a lot of angst, is that the governing board in the eyes of the law is viewed as a legal person, but just one legal person, which means they can only have one opinion at a time. And we quite often see where a board will be 4-3 on a particular issue, but the three people who are aggrieved go out and then badmouth the decision. Board solidarity is critical in an effective board, and that once the decision is made, it's binding on all directors to support it. And if the directors that struggle with that generally, I think, need to be coached and mentored to realise that they do have that shared obligation. And that's a workshop all in its own. Principle also would see the board with no executive committee, because I argue that that actually splits accountability, in that if every director has equal and shared responsibility both at the legal and moral level, then to have a group that meets separately, perhaps with the CEO or others, I believe fractures that, and I don't support an executive committee. And as I say, that can be quite a contentious issue, particularly if the organisation has had it for many years. It would also see the removal of a casting vote, and tied motions are lost in that case. I don't support and when I say generally good governance doesn't support the idea of having a casting vote, that if a chair wants to pass a deliberative vote, that's fine. But then again, for them to be able to vote a second time with the argument that it breaks the deadlock, my advice and recommendations are normally put it a second time to the members, give them time, or the directors, to deliberate over it. And if they're still locked in, I'd say that it needs to be postponed and brought back at another time. The issue of independent directors is a thorny issue, but one which is well worth the debate. And I know many organisations say, well, we simply just don't have the amount of people to be able to do that. Okay, I can accept that. But I would coach people to say, if you can't prove to be independent by virtue of not holding a conflicting position with a member body, at least operate independently. And those are the sorts of principles you embed in your board charter, that we will always act independently and in the best interests of the organisation as a whole. So, independent directors. This is a little bit curly, but it's something I think that's good for boards to keep front of mind, is that they are elected governors, and as such, they can have that privilege or that responsibility removed from them. And members should always have that power to call a special general meeting, put a motion to their fellow members, and remove the board if they've lost confidence in them. They can remove one director, they can remove the lot, or a few. And it's a salient point because, it requires a special resolution of those in attendance and eligible to vote, so 75% generally. But I think it's just an important thing to make sure that is allowed for in the Constitution, and that boards are mindful that they're governors, not owners. So what does an ideal board look like? It's displays leadership, integrity and good judgment. They use those three attributes to ensure effective decision making. And finally, they ensure the association demonstrates transparency, accountability and responsibility. Thank you.
Good work, Grogs. Thank you very much. I do have a question for you, actually. I'm going to have a look at some of the questions that have been coming in as well. Grogs, I was particularly interested, before you go to the back benches there, about the concept of ownership versus stewardship. In your opinion, of the organisations that you've worked with, how many boards, if you were to put a percentage on it, how many boards were in the ownership model and how many boards are in the stewardship model?
I think there's a continuum, and it depends on the organisation. I think in the sport, we probably, in the sports sector, are not as progressive as many of the other agencies are in the not-for-profit. But I do believe that we're making headway, and that people are realising that it is about service leadership, about servant leadership.